Okay, so this is the third video lecture on the topic of race and ethnicity. In this lecture, I want to talk about prejudice and stereotypes and some of the theories behind why some people are more prejudiced than others. Prejudice simply means to prejudge. It's based on usually it's assumed to be based on limited interaction or limited information. You can have both negative and positive prejudices, where you draw over generalized conclusions about a group of people. For instance, an example of a positive prejudice might be that Asian students are good at math, or that male students are better at math, or something like this. Generally, when we talk about prejudice, we're talking about negative attitudes, so that's generally how the term gets used. Some would argue that even the positive prejudices are not good because, for instance, the classic example of the Asian student is good with math would mean that I, as an instructor, I might overgeneralize. I might stereotype and say, "Oh well, I assume that or I'm going to prejudge the student will be good at math," and that's what we mean by stereotype, is when we overgeneralize groups and we see them all the same. I read somewhere, or I like the metaphor of what a stereotype is it's a weed that's grown out of place, right? So it's a weed that's kind of, so there's a little kernel of truth usually in a stereotype. It is true that Asian students score better on math tests. That's true, but when we take that little kernel of truth and we apply it to all Asian students, then that means when I have an Asian student in my class, I assume that they're going to be really good at math and they're not going to need my help, and then that student has a disadvantage, right? So the real risk, or I used to use this example of of relating how prejudices and stereotypes and discrimination is an action. So discrimination is when I hold this attitude in my mind and this stereotype, and then I act on that. So I may have had, and how all of these really get based on having limited amount of interaction. So let's say I've eaten one red apple and one green apple, right? Well, I enjoyed that red apple more. So I will take my limited amount of prejudice attitude, and when I go to the grocery store, I will only try red apples because my experience is red apples are good and green apples are bad, and I will apply this assumption to all apples. Individually, I will discriminate and I will only pick red apples and I will never pick green apples. But eventually, I get this job in a grocery store and I'm working in the produce, and in the produce, I take my own experiences with red and green apples and I buy more red apples because people won't like green apples. And so I buy more red apples because red apples are just better. That's my individual discrimination, my individual prejudice. And lo and behold, if the store doesn't make more money selling red apples compared to green apples, well, I told you so. See, I told you all that red apples were better. Well, now I've institutionalized the discrimination, because when people come to the grocery store now, they have to choose red apples because there are hardly any green apples at all, right? And that all has begun with my individual limited amount of prejudice, and it gets built into the structure. But I think I'm actually ahead of myself on another slide. Racism is a kind of prejudice. All isms refer to a negative prejudice, but racism is a kind of prejudice around race. Almost exclusively, well, for our purposes and social scientific purposes, all racism is negative, right? That you can't be, and it's perceived to be a negative attitude towards another group. It's routinely used to justify inferior treatment, or substandard, inferior treatment of another group. Any kind of isms assume that one group there's something wrong with them and they should be changed, right? So when to make observations about a group that are not judgmental or don't imply one group is better than another would not be racist. It would simply be an observation about the group. For instance, To say that there is a that there are more black men incarcerated is not a racist assumption. It is a statement of the social pattern. To say that black men are bad and that's why there's more incarcerated, that would be a racist assumption. So there's always that built-in notion of badness. You have overt versus subtle, so explicitly racism, and then you all know about backhanded compliments, and that would be an example of sort of subtle racism. I did have a friend back in graduate school, a black man, and he had lived in Louisiana and he had lived in Minnesota, and he said he honestly preferred the kind of racism in the South to the racism in the North because it was more explicit, it was more overt. He knew his place. He didn't always have to wonder, were people treating him that way because of his race. It was just more straightforward. White supremacy, and I know this could be a touchy concept, or a potentially politically charged concept, but white supremacy is an attitude. It's a prejudicial attitude. It's a bias that assumes that white ways of being, the way that white people do things, the way that white people dress, the way that their music, the way they structure their family life, the way they decorate their house, that those are better ways than ways that people who are not white. So white supremacy, and then the notion is that white supremacy is riddled throughout our culture. That white ways are considered when you hear terms like you got to talk white, or people of color will often will I have heard experiences where people of color talking about how when they answer the phone, they have to use their white voice, or when they're with their friends who are also people of color, they take on sort of a different way of being. That's an example of white supremacy. White supremacy, that in order to be accepted by the politically dominant group, the majority, you act white, right? Okay, there's a couple theories about why this is so, about why some people embrace more racist attitudes, these theories of racism. I think the one that makes the most sense to me, if you've ever seen the movie Gran Torino, right? Gran Torino, it's a story about a Korean vet, and in his community, he's an old guy, and in his community there's a bunch of Korean people who living around him, and he has very hostile attitudes towards his neighbors, and this is based on his experience that he had when he was serving in the military. So, frustration aggression hypothesis says that basically people, if you remember the triangle, I should get another one out, but basically the people that are feeling that their relative social location, their relative social status is being threatened, that they have to blame somebody. So this is the classic explanation of the scapegoat. Something bad is happening to me. I can't do anything about it. I'm going to blame you. And I need to there's a great cartoon. I need to put it in here somewhere, but it's a image of the boss is yelling at the man comes home and he yells at his wife, the wife yells at the son turns and kicks the dog, right? Everybody has to blame somebody else. So what the frustration aggression hypothesis says is that the people who are feeling most frustrated, they gotta blame somebody, they're going to direct their hostilities to a racial group or to another racial group. And that would be the scapegoat. In the Old Testament, the scapegoat was you put all your sins on the goat and then you let the goat escape, right? And it would take all of your sins, all of the bad things away. It's if I lost my job, it must be because of those brown people who are willing to work for less money, and then the stereotype is that all those brown people got here illegal, and so that sort of thing. The authoritarian personality is a theoretical model that says you can predict people's you can predict the degree to which somebody is going to express, going to hold racist ideas based on some pretty classic personality characteristics. For instance, people who are express excessive conformity, deference to authority. They're intolerant. Often they have they're personally insecure. They're suspicious. I have in quotations here, I have conservative because of what I mean by conservative versus liberal. Conservative meaning not changing, right? Traditional, don't change attitudes about politics and religion. It was better before, kind of thing. Less educated, and people who have less economic opportunity or less economic mobility are more likely to hold racist attitudes. But these kinds of things, I would argue, go together. That if one is limited education, that's going to limit their their ability to move about the economic structure a little bit, right? If they have limited education, they might be intolerant to differences because they don't understand differences. When we're sort of down here in this economic structure and things are changing all around us, that can be very frightening, and it can make us very uncomfortable, and we can feel very aggressive, right? Very frustrated and very aggressive. And we direct that hostility towards groups that our culture has told us are less than us. And when we see groups who are who our culture we've learned are less than us, right? Because they're brown or there's some other, they look different. We see them, then they appear to be doing better than we are. We see them taking our place. That can make us very angry, and we can direct our negative attitudes towards them. And I'm going to stop right here.